It's March, and at long last, the industry sees the resumption of two large-scale in-person conferences. One is an inaugural event, and the other a long-standing conference and exhibition that's been hosted for decades. I'm of course talking about ViVE, which just concluded in Miami, and HIMSS in Orlando, which starts March 14th. I'm your host, Carol Flagg, and on this special episode of the show, I sit down with James Aita, the Director of Strategy and Business Development for Medicomp Systems, North America, and Grace Vinton, a seasoned PR expert at Amendola Communications. The three of us recorded our conversation at ViVE, and we give our impressions of the conference. Listen in and hear what we had to share as participants, and ask as well, is there room in our industry for two large health IT conferences?
Well, I'm here today at ViVE for a special episode of What's My Tagline with two of my very favorite peeps in the world, James Aita and Grace Vinton. I already told the audience who you two are, but I'm really excited to be sitting down with you on the second day of ViVE.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah.
We love being here with you.
Oh, I love having you. And even though we're together live, we're not recording over Zoom, and this is a special, I guess, episode of What's My Tagline, you still get the same question as if you had to describe yourself with a tagline, what would it be? But I think it has to have a ViVE spin to it. So who would like to go first?
I mean, I'm happy to go first. And it's really based on, I'm really excited about what's going on in the industry, health IT industry right now. And so for me, I think this is the time for healthcare data to be exchanged finally and to be made usable. So for me at ViVE this year, it's making clinical data usable.
Oh, I like it. I like it. Miss Vinton.
Absolutely. I would just say innovation that saves lives at home.
Yeah, right. So really, we're all together now 2 years after the start of COVID. And in a way, it makes us feel, I think, very lucky, right? But also, I think, more aware than any time, I suppose, in the time that I've been in healthcare about the challenges that the industry is facing, and that they need to get solved. So today, I think we're going to be talking about this conference, and especially with HIMSS coming up next week, what we're experiencing at the end of day 2 at ViVE, an inaugural conference, although, it's a partnership between Health and Chime. But I think we're going to start with that. So my first question is, what is the vibe on ViVE?
I think they were expecting you to ask exactly that, phrased that way. I have to be honest, they have done a fantastic job with this show. I'm really, really impressed, not only with, the way that they've created great events and networking opportunities, but they really did get an incredible group of people to hear, very high level people from just about every organization that you would want to interface with on the private sector, on the public sector side. The sessions that I've seen have been very, very impressive, and everybody seems to be really excited to get together and actually do business and to move things forward. And to talk about big new ideas in the industry, and ways to really move things forward in a way that I haven't felt in a long time. I'm really excited about some of these big ideas now.
Yeah, quite a few people I spoke to said as soon as they walked off of the tarmac, in the airport, they felt the warmth. And I think, it's in Miami. There's this warmth and sunshine. And, I think the digital health investment community being included in these events now is adding a different level of excitement. It's new blood, it's fresh perspective. And this, all the money that's being poured into the space. It's like all these things we dreamed about that could potentially come to fruition can actually happen now. And so there's a hope that's kind of bustling from people being stuck inside for so long and not being able to see people. But now, everyone can finally be together and can talk about the exciting things happening. And so the excitement is just the word that everyone keeps saying, excitement. Right.
Well, and I think, you've had some things that really shifted in our industry in the last 2-3 years because of COVID, right?
Sure.
There's no question that telehealth is here to stay.
Yeah.
That's obvious. But that has, I think, catapulted the need for things around telehealth, the data around telehealth. Obviously, with COVID, we all were like, this data isn't getting shared properly. That's a huge problem. And so it feels like the sea change that needed to happen is starting to actually really happen. I mean, Tevka, you got that too. And so that has kind of brought in this the money and these things finally being adopted. Like, you can really feel like there's a new guard coming to really push things forward.
Yeah, I walked off that tarmac thinking, "Wow, it's humid here." And then I thought about the excitement, but the first thought really was the humidity. And to both of your points, though, this the last 2 years with COVID, it obviously pointed a big shining spotlight on this issue of data, right? And there's a power behind data, and this is obviously, we live in a digital age, but that spotlight was a bad spotlight, right? And I think lives probably were lost, and it was I think a big awakening for the industry overall, saying we need to change, and we can't be like typical healthcare where we can take decades to change it. This needs to change now. It already had to change, but now it really has to change. So, talk about that issue of data, right? Just from a 30,000 feet up, real quick.
I mean, yeah, I just sat on a panel or watched a panel with all the major players on the QHIN front. This Tevka. It was the Tevka panel. Yeah, and they're talking about there's data is already starting to move. They're saying they're moving a billion records a month now between some of these big networks. So things are starting to move. I think there's a lot of players that aren't in that space, but with Tevka coming and with the enforcement coming, there's no question that the data is going to start to move. How good is that data going to be? How usable is that data going to be? That's a huge question. But you're also seeing, like, you walk around the floor here and you see a bunch of new vendors that are popping up that are creating data lakes and that are just there to move big chunks of data from wherever they can get it, whether it's from CMS or SureScripts or wherever they can grab it from, and then being able to do stuff with it. And players that I've never heard of before, and we're walking around going, okay, this is something's happening here. You can see that something's happening, and they're getting lots and lots of venture money to do this stuff, and customers and all this kind of stuff. So, there's no question as you walk along here that this data is starting to move, and it's going to start moving real fast.
I keep thinking of it like a dam. Like, the dam is opening up and the data's going to flow. Right. And another thing that people are talking about here is the cybersecurity issues. And that's been a huge conversation topic. There's a cybersecurity pavilion with talks all day, and they've been packed out. And there's going to be issues with cybersecurity. Absolutely. There were increased issues because of remote work.
Right.
During the pandemic, but then it's gonna get crazy as soon as that data gets flowing more and more too.
Right, of course. So, we can't be here at ViVE, which is the inaugural event of Health plus Chime, without all of us who have been attending HIMSS for many years. Drawing comparisons. That's a very natural thing for us to do, right?
Sure.
Because we're human beings, and we're, most of us are going to be, at HIMSS next week,
I'm not
right?
leaving Florida, so.
There are people who will be here in Florida for 2 weeks, right?
Absolutely.
So I'd like to open up that dialogue a little bit here, as, an exhibitor who spends money, as, a PR expert who has clients that spend money going to conferences, and obviously now that COVID has waned, the conferences are going to be, probably back to maybe not to where they were, but certainly back in the game here. What are your perspectives? How are ViVE and HIMSS potentially alike, and how are they different?
I mean, I think it's obvious that they're trying to draw the same crowd of people, or in part the same crowd of people.
They are, yeah.
I think you already mentioned that ViVE has got a lot of this investment money that's really bringing this kind of new energy to the space. These new vendors that we're seeing popping up here that have entirely new business models that are very interesting. And they're doing it's obvious that ViVE has made a point to try to solve a lot of things or make the experience better for exhibitors and for attendees that over the years HIMSS maybe hasn't put the same kind of energy towards, and has has frustrated certain people because of that. I think that they find it's obvious that they find a huge opportunity there, and it's felt on the side of, as an exhibitor and as an attendee as well, that they're really putting the effort in, and I suspect that this conference will get quite big over time. I mean, this is the first year they had an amazing turnout,
Right.
But I suspect it'll get bigger. I think that if I was HIMSS, I'd be concerned about that and notice the threat. But I think overall, it's a pretty entertaining analogy to me of the health IT industry as a whole. You've got some pretty antiquated technology that's been around, certain vendors that I won't name that seem to think that there's no threat to them, and they don't need to work on that technology to kind of create the competitive benefit from a user perspective. And there's certainly players that I think have the opportunity to disrupt that, and I think that's what ViVE is trying to do from a conference perspective.
Disruption.
Yeah.
Absolutely. From a patient perspective too, these investors are patients. So the topics are not as heady as at HIMSS. At HIMSS, they're speaking to these healthcare executives making decisions, purchasing decisions, and detailed, technical educational sessions. Here, the sessions are a little bit more high level, to really relate to those investors who relate to health IT as patients. And so it's been interesting, to see the patient advocacy and patient empowerment, health equity, and topics that are really of interest and of importance, critical importance to patients, really coming to the forefront in a natural way. And one really cool thing they did here at ViVE was a walking gallery, where patients had their jackets painted with a picture of their story, their patient's story.
Right,
and they've been walking around the halls and, answering questions if they come. And every once in a while, some of the investment groups will invite them up and say, thank you for coming and thank you for being here. And I think, investors, once you invest in something that saves lives, why would you invest in anything else?
Oh,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think really ViVE is coming and realizing these investors are consumers. They're healthcare people, they're patients. So, that's been interesting to see too, how they have really, drawn to that audience.
Right. I thought it was really, I think there are a lot of interesting things going on here at ViVE, even more new things, as somebody who's attended health in the last few years. But, coupling with Chime, I think they sort of made that pivot towards that audience in a smart way, whereas, health tends to be a much wider diversity of the community. If you go to health, it's it's wearables, it's so the consumer focus, a little bit of pharma, and med tech, and some a little bit of health IT, but obviously this event, they've taken that health vibe, but partnering with Chime to give it that health IT feel. Like when you walk in, when you walk into health, I guess it's really obvious that it's a vast variety of
people,
of people and companies. But here you walk into ViVE and you're walking up and down. It's really clear. Health IT.
Yes.
With health IT, there's no
It's
question.
health IT with a strong emphasis on digital health.
It's health IT
too,
and digital health with a very strong, very strong emphasis. I think, walking around the exhibit floor, which I think another interesting thing they do, not the only thing, but is this sort of, I guess, what I would term like booth parity, right? I mean, you just can't have, this gigantic McMansion of an exhibit.
Yeah, that's been fascinating. There's no McMansions here.
There's no McMansions here. It's James, how many sizes do they have? 3? I mean,
there's like the biggest booth here is probably a 30 by 30.
I think that is the biggest.
Like
and those are
we have a 10 by 10 turnkey. We sent them the graphics and showed up and everything was done.
Yeah,
that's a pretty cool setup to have for someone like us that, I mean, we normally have a massive booth at HIMSS.
Right.
So, and this was enough for us. And, I think that the networking, the quality of the networking is so good. And because the exhibitor space is a bit smaller, but you have a really good group of people here.
Right.
It's pretty good. It's great. It was great for us. And I had the opportunity to chat with the, I think she's the COO of Chime, because I didn't really know very much about Chime except for that they had, their meetings every year at HIMSS. And so I asked her a little bit more about that and learned a little bit more about that. And what's interesting that they've done here is that because they have their forum meetings at HIMSS, they're also able to attract all of the CEOs of all of the HR companies. They're all here.
Right.
And they've been here for a day or two. Maybe not all of them are staying for the entirety of the show, but that's an attraction because they have all the CIOs from, the meetings from the Chime forums. They also have all the CEOs of the HR vendors. So, when you have that, it's natural that all of the other executives want to be around that. So, they've done a good job. I'm impressed.
Yeah. Another thing that I noticed too about the layout and the floor is that they have you're eating together lunch. And so that's just another way that you can network with a wide variety of people. And I've met CIOs, I met CMIOs, I met executives at companies. I saw companies talking about synergies they might have and ways they might be able to work together. And so that's been very interesting too, just the different ways that they were able to kind of draw people together and network with the way that they laid out, the booths and the way that they did lunch.
Yeah, I think their whole concept, again, brought over from health is that, people that eat together and drink together will naturally have conversations together.
Yes.
And so they do that. Breakfast, lunch, and cocktail,
and
right?
The food was pretty good.
It was.
The food, and it's not over yet, right? Exactly.
Yeah. And the networking events have been really good, too. The ones that even, that they're putting on, I've been impressed. They've been big events. There's been good food. There's been,
Another thing that I
that.
appreciated, too, is that the educational sessions on the exhibit floor, they were very well attended. I mean, they were packed out, like Interoperability Now, the Cybersecurity Pavilion, the different types of things that they had on the floor were very well attended, and you got to meet people there as well.
Like the TED Talk.
The Tech Talks. Yes, and the Tech Talks were fantastic. And so that was another interesting thing, because if you were kind of stuck on the exhibit floor, you could still interact with some of the educational things happening. If you, were in the exhibit hall and couldn't go out to the other sessions happening, there was a lot going on and a lot of movement and excitement happening just on the floor itself.
Just happening here.
Yeah.
So as we sort of, wind down our conversation here a little bit, just put your crystal ball out in front of you. These two conferences, back to back, going forward, is there room for two?
I think so. I think for the immediate future, certainly. I mean, I think that this conference is going to get quite a bit bigger quite quickly. I think they'll take a bite out of HIMSS for sure. And there's certainly people who won't be attending both. I've already talked to a number of people that go to HIMSS every year, and they're not attending both. They're attending this one or that one, and so that's normal. Medicomp Systems, our company, we will certainly be at both. Different presences for both.
Sure.
But one of the things that was actually really interesting for us being here is that you have certain people from a company that are here this week, and they don't have the rest of their staff there, but they will be there maybe at HIMSS, right? And so this has been a great setup for us to maybe do some initial intros, meet some people, and say, hey, let's do a bigger, longer sit down at HIMSS with the rest of your executive team or whatever. And so that's been really cool because they're back to back. It's a week later, and you set up your meeting and away you go, and quite quickly you can create some really substantial business. So that's a really interesting strategy for us anyway.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people are really saying, okay, ViVE's networking, okay, HIMSS is learning. And that's kind of seems to be the vibe that I'm hearing about from people, is just that, this is a great place to meet people, like you said, and to network and to make deals with other vendors, to, meet some people. And then, at HIMSS, we're going to learn about stuff, and we're going to get the education we want. We're going to really be able to talk and learn from people's stories and things. So I think there is place for both. This is a huge industry, and it's growing, it's expanding, it's exploding, and it's not the same world it was before the pandemic. It's not. So there's definitely room for both.
Yeah. I think there is room for both. I agree with that. I was talking with somebody pretty I guess, pretty high up the food chain of the ViVE event. And his comment was, he feels in one sentence that, ViVE is a networking event and HIMSS is a trade show event, and right away that just paints a different picture in your head as to what kind of event you can expect. So I can see, to your point, James, that if you're if you're a hospital system, your provider, maybe the people that you send to ViVE are not going to be the same people.
Yeah.
You're going to send your chief nursing officers to HIMSS, or the people that need certification, and maybe it is the CFOs and CIOs at this particular conference.
I think there's something to be said for keeping the event fairly small also, right? Because you have a smaller group of people that are all executives, that are all sort of decision makers and have the ability to move the needle forward. There's something to be said for keeping it small. You can be in different venues and cities where everything's close to each other, and you can have so many networking events going on in a given evening, like yesterday. And today there's tons of events happening. They're all next to each other. It's easy to get around. When you have a huge trade show like HIMSS, all of that logistics becomes so much more difficult, and getting in to find the right person or meet the right person, it becomes much more difficult. So I like that it's smaller like this. I like that it's got a really kind of selective group of people that you want to meet. And for us, it's been fantastic.
Another really interesting thing is they really have incentives for CIOs to meet with folks. If you do 4 meetings, then you get your pass free.
Right.
And so that's very interesting and fascinating, here at ViVE. And so that kind of gives incentives for CIOs to take the meetings and to make the conversations and have the conversations. So, I think that's something that HIMSS could actually take away from ViVE.
Good learning lesson.
And, maybe doing more educational sessions is something that ViVE could take away from HIMSS.
From HIMSS, right. James, Grace, thank you so much for sharing your time today here at ViVE.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
You can more about James Aita at MedicompSystems.com, at Grace Vinton at acmarketing.com. And be sure to follow them on Twitter at HealthTechJames and High Tea with Grace. Also, make sure you connect with them and follow them on LinkedIn. You can more about this show on the program page at healthcareNowRadio.com. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at Carol Flagg or LinkedIn. Have a topic or guest idea for the show? Send an email to Carol at HealthcareNowRadio. Until next time, I want to know, what's your tagline?